You're never more than 10 minutes away from the latest news, weather, and traffic. News Radio 93.1 WFLA.
Empire actor Jussie Smollett. He said he was attacked in what was a hate crime on the streets of Chicago. Says he was beat up, they spit on him, called him the N-word, and said, "You're not allowed here in MAGA country." That was a homophobic and racist attack and all of this stuff. Turns out that what investigators are finding is that, no, he orchestrated this whole thing and had one of his buddies and someone else, two Nigerian brothers, fake this whole thing because they wanted to make Trump look bad. It's literally another example of fake news against Trump. It's funny how these people hate Trump and want to hurt Trump, and it seems like they try every chance they can to help Trump by proving his point about fake news. One of the first people to point out that this was probably fakes, that this was probably a hoax, was John Ziegler. He writes for Mediaite. He was also on Glenn Beck's show this morning, which is on this station 9 to noon. And he pointed out days ago that this is probably a hoax. Now, this is someone who doesn't like Trump, so he has no interest in defending Trump here, but he pointed out that a lot of this story doesn't make sense. And then he talks about how this is not just a one-time thing. And I think he's exactly right. This was him on Glenn Beck this morning. Talk about this is like an epidemic.
I hope that we don't just look at this, as the left wants us to, as an isolated incident.
Oh, no,
like
it's not.
This is somehow unique. This is an epidemic. This is an epidemic, especially in the realm of hate crime situations.
So he's basically pointing out that over and over again, these fake stories, especially in hate crime situations, keep coming out. And that it's like an epidemic. It's not just this is just a one-time thing. No, there's a bunch of fake stories out there like this. Then he gave an example as well, a comparison of this story and the whole Kavanaugh incident. I think he's right. Here it is.
We were told the reason we believe Christine Ford is that a prominent person would never tell an untruth about an allegation like this. That would never happen. What do they possibly have to gain? No one would ever do this and put themselves through this. Well, now we know that's bullcrap.
He's right. That was literally the argument I heard over and over again from liberals and other people on the left when it came to the whole Kavanaugh thing and the Blasey Ford thing. That's what they were saying. Oh, well, she can't be lying. She sounds so truthful, so it must be true because there's no interest in lying. Well, a lot of people would say that about this situation, except it seems like he is lying and continues to lie about it, refuses to talk to Chicago police now. Now, the big point that he makes, though, and he's exactly right, why does stuff like this really happen in this country? And why do the media jump on this so fast? Other than being anti-Trump, here's why.
We now live in a world where being the right kind of victim is the American dream. That's the biggest false premise of the whole thing. People presume we're still living in 19 whatever it was when being a victim was somehow an item of shame. It's not an item of shame anymore. And by the way, maybe it never should have been, but the pendulum has swung so far in the other direction. People want to be a victim. You get adulation, you get attention, you get money in certain situations. I believe Colin Kaepernick figured this out.
Is he not right there? That there is this obsession in this country right now to want to be a victim because you get all this attention, especially from the media and the left? He's exactly right. This obsession in this whole case really is just beyond reason.
You're never more than 10 minutes away from the latest news, weather, and traffic. News Radio 93.1 WFLA.
By the way, if you want to find out more about me, more commentary by me, what you can do is follow me on Twitter at PMOWFLA, or find me on Facebook. You can go to the website as well, WFLAOrlando.com, search PM Orlando. I wrote some blogs last week, over the weekend. I post Facebook posts. I'm on Twitter a lot. So you can catch out all of those things, and you can catch the podcast of this show and my other show, Beyond Reason Radio, on iHeartRadio. So there was something else that Laura Logan said. Didn't get as much attention as everything else because obviously the media bias thing is what's going to get all of the attention. But there was something else she said that I really thought were words of wisdom, not really just for the media, but for everyone in politics today, because it really just makes sense, and it's not what we're doing. Now, she was obviously referencing Jim Acosta here, but I think there was a lot of different media people that she could be talking about. And frankly, I think there's a lot of politicians, including sometimes the president, that she could be talking about. Here's what she said.
And I don't mean, backing someone being rude at a press conference at the White House, because quite frankly, I haven't seen a lot of that kind of behavior in my lifetime. I never saw someone treat George Bush like that. And I say that to my colleagues, and they say, well, George Bush never treated us the way, this president does. And I say, well, yeah, but I don't tell my kids, oh, that kid's an so you can just be an to him, right? I tell my kids, you have to be consistently live to the standards that, that you have set for yourself. And even when someone's an asshole to you, you still have to be the better person and a good person, and you have to rise above it and not sink to their level. So what happened to that, right? Yeah.
So she was talking about the fact that a lot of the so-called journalists out there and what they say to the president of the United States, and mostly talking about Jim Acosta, that they feel justified in really bashing the president and really using press conferences to grandstand and call him names and all this stuff. They feel justified in doing that because, well, the president acts in a bad way.
Well, also, he's baiting him. He wants him to go off the handle on something, Well,
yeah, of course, because there is an agenda there. And we could talk about the aspect of there being an agenda, but I think the bigger point is really interesting because they say, well, basically what the reporters are saying is, well, he started it, so we're just continuing on. And she's like, is that what you would teach your children? That's not what I teach my children. Just because someone else acts like a jerk doesn't give you the right to act like a jerk. And if you're a journalist, maybe that should be more of a standard, that if you set these standards for yourselves, maybe you should live up to those standards. But they don't. Nobody does in today's political climate. All I hear all the time is fight fire with fire. They're bad, so we have to be bad. And it was refreshing to hear a former reporter say, just because they're bad doesn't mean we have to be bad. Maybe we can be good. There's a thought. By the way, a lot of what President Trump says about the media, it's a reaction to something they did. So if the media was actually fair and unbiased for the most part, they wouldn't get as much reaction from Trump in that way. So I'm not excusing everything Trump does or says. If you've ever listened to me, I criticize him for a lot of the things he says as well. But there's a good point to be had that maybe we should do what we teach our children. That two wrongs don't make a right. That just because they're bad and they're jerks doesn't mean that we should act like jerks as well. Or we can just all be like children. Sometimes when you watch these press conferences, it's like watching a bunch of children fight with one another. You started it. No, I didn't. I'm rubber, you're glue. Whatever you said bounces off me, sticks to you. I mean, they basically might as well say that stuff with the way things are. It's just become beyond reason.
Weather and traffic for the smartest audience in talk radio. News Radio 93.1 WFLA.
Well, I think Andrew McCabe has made a fool out of himself over the last couple of days, and he really looks to me like sort of a poor man's J. Edgar Hoover. I think he's a disaster.
You can't help but laugh when Trump says stuff like that. He's talking about the former deputy director of the FBI, Andrew McCabe, who has been all over the news circuits this week because he's pushing his new book. It's all about being against Trump. Now, we talked about this earlier this week because he was saying he believes that Trump was a threat, and he talked about why maybe they could use the 25th Amendment against Trump and all this other stuff in a 60 Minutes interview, and now he's doing all this other stuff. But there's something that he said that really caught my attention on this whole issue, and I wonder if you noticed it as well. But let's play the first cut.
There is no doubt in my mind that the president, through his through his behavior and his words and his projections on Twitter, is undermining the effectiveness and the strength of those institutions on a daily basis. That's the thing that Americans should be focused on and thinking about right now.
So this is another thing he talks about in his book as well, and his whole point that is what Trump has been saying out there on Twitter and everything else against the FBI, against the intelligence community and the campaign, and recently when they disagree with him, is undermining our fundamental institutions, undermining democracy. How could President Trump do this? It's not like the FBI did anything wrong. No, Comey was, pure. He was the leader that we all loved. McCabe, he was just the leader, even though he got fired for lying. But these people are perfect. It's Trump who is at fault. Then he said something else. This was all in an interview with CNN's Anderson Cooper. And he said something else that caught my attention and totally discounts the first thing he said, in my humble opinion. This is what he said.
Do you still believe the president could be a Russian asset?
I think it's possible. I think that's why we started our investigation, and I'm really anxious to see where Director Mueller concludes that.
Well, speaking of Director Mueller, by the way, we talked about that earlier in the show, but Director Mueller's report is supposed to come out next week, and then the Attorney General will look at it, release it to Congress, and decide what will be released to the public. But you see what he said there? He's asked, do you think the President of the United States could be a Russian asset? Now, someone who is a professional FBI agent who realizes that there's no real evidence that Trump is a Russian asset goes on national TV more than once and says, it's possible. It's possible. Who is undermining our institutions more? President Trump with some of the stuff he says, or people in the FBI like Andrew McCabe who start investigations against the President of the United States basically because they took it personally that he fired the FBI director.
And it was basically a fishing expedition.
It was a fishing. You're exactly right, Tom Benson. They still don't have any evidence. And as we talked about earlier, the Mueller report is probably going to be anticlimactic, which is why the Democrats in Congress are investigating other things. So you have Adam Schiff talking about investigating Trump's personal finances and the inauguration committee and all this other stuff because they know that the collusion aspect, the whole campaign collusion with Russian aspect, that there's nothing there. So they have to expand their investigations and keep it going because Mueller's not going to have anything. But to me, you're a former director of the FBI. It seems incredibly irresponsible to me to go on national television, just because you have a personal gripe against the president, to go on national television and say, oh, well, yeah, he could be a Russian asset. Do we realize what we're saying and what we're putting out there? You want to talk about undermining our institutions? Yes, I don't agree with everything Trump says. If you ever listen to me, you know that. Sometimes he goes way too far on things. I've said that over and over again. But to act like Comey and McCabe are pure as the wind-driven snow just makes me laugh when you can tell these people are slimy as anything and they take things personally just like Trump does. By the way, Trump reacted to all of this. Go ahead and play his reaction.
He is a disgraced man. He was terminated. Not by me, he was terminated by others. The IG report was a disaster from his standpoint. Anybody reading the IG report would say, how could a man like this be involved with the FBI?
So, and that's true. The Inspector General's report, which was done by the Justice Department, looked at Andrew McCabe and said, this guy has got to go. That was one reason why he was fired. It wasn't even because of Trump. But when McCabe was asked in these different interviews, what evidence do you have that Trump could be a Russian asset? What evidence did you have to start this investigation? What evidence did you have to start getting this stuff leaked so a special counsel could be appointed? All he ever had was surface stuff. Well, Trump said some things in the campaign positive about Russia.
The fishing expedition is a lot like the way some journalists, so-called journalists at newspapers, do a story. They have a premise, and what they do is they find people to talk that's going to lead to the premise and support it.
Yeah, all of this started, and we talked about this earlier this week, all of this started when Comey was fired, and McCabe was like, Well, why was he fired? Well, he's a Russian asset. That's why he's fired. When it's almost obvious. And Andrew McCarthy had a great piece in the National Review pointing this out. There was one question that the CBS reporters, the 60 Minutes reporters, didn't ask Andrew McCabe. Andrew McCabe was talking about Trump wanted Russia mentioned in Rosenstein's report about Comey being fired. Mm-hmm. And McCabe said, well, that's because maybe he's a Russian asset, and he was obsessed with Russia. But the reason why, in 60 Minutes didn't follow up on this, the reason why Trump wanted Russia mentioned is because Comey kept mentioning to Trump that he was not a target of the investigation. And Trump wanted Comey to make that public because it was hurting his administration, all this news, all this controversy over the Russia thing. And Comey would tell Trump privately that, oh, well, you're not a target of the investigation, but he wouldn't say so publicly. And that's why Trump was really upset. That's why Trump was really mad, and that was one of the reasons why Trump fired Comey. It's obvious to anyone who can see, but McCabe took it so personally that Comey was fired and didn't like Trump's personal style for many different reasons, including stuff dealing with his wife, that he decides to start an investigation into the president and doesn't say anything when Rosenstein wants to use the 25th Amendment, possibly, to get Trump out of office. When people like McCabe and people like Rosenstein are supposed to be the ones with good judgment, are supposed to be the ones protecting our institutions, and they know that's not what the 25th Amendment was for. They know exactly that's not what the 25th Amendment was for, but they were looking at it anyway. So who's really undermining our institutions? I admit Trump doesn't help sometimes, but neither does these people in the FBI. Everyone is to blame, in my opinion.
You're never more than 10 minutes away from the latest news, weather, and traffic. News Radio 93.1 WFLA.
To make things worse, the accusations within this phony attack received national attention for weeks. Celebrities, news commentators, and even presidential candidates weighed in on something that was choreographed by an actor.
That was the Chicago police superintendent today talking about the Jussie Smollett case, who was arrested for filing a false police report and was out on $100,000 bail. That's according to reports. He filed a false report saying that he was attacked by two Trump supporters for being gay and black. But he's right, though. The media, politicians, especially on the Democrat side, Adam Schiff, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, all were in a rush to believe this guy's story, to believe that it was possible that two Trump supporters in Chicago during a polar vortex were going to attack this guy. Why were they in such a rush to believe it? Why were so many in the media in the left wanting to believe it? Well, let's play a couple examples of this, actually. They kind of give their own answers. Don Lemon, who is black and gay himself, CNN analyst. He says he's a journalist. He's an analyst. He's an opinion guy. Come on. Just be honest here. This is what he said about the whole situation.
Can we be honest? But to certain groups of people, even if they were skeptical, they said, I hope this is not true. Black folks, gay folks.
Of course.
People are like, oh my God, I hope he's
and you know why? And you know why black folk and gay folks say that? Because
they're real victims of.
Well, because they are real victims of homophobia and of racism, but also because unfortunately we tend to all be painted with the same brush.
All right, so that's them reacting to that. They wanted to believe this. But there's another one who even got it more right. Jonathan Capehart was on MSNBC. He writes for the Washington Post. He hit the nail on the head on why so many wanted to believe this.
Just the circumstances and the way he told the story and what he said happened to him sort of fit in with not a narrative, but a reality for a lot of people in this country since President Trump was inaugurated, that there is an atmosphere of menace and an atmosphere of hate around the country that made it possible for people to either readily believe or want to believe Jussie Smollett.
The thing is, that's not true. There isn't really an atmosphere of hate out there. In fact, it's not out there so much that he had to make up a story of it because it's not real. I think they wanted to believe this because they hate this country. Not only do they hate Trump and their supporters, but they hate this country. In their mindset, they have to believe that this country is racist and homophobic and bigoted, and they just can't get out of that mindset that maybe this country is the most prosperous, peaceful, tolerant country in the history of mankind. And if you're gay, black, whatever, you have a chance to actually succeed beyond your wildest dreams in this country, and you will be accepted and tolerated no matter what your beliefs. The fact that the media bought into this so easily is just beyond reason.
You're never more than 10 minutes away from the latest news, weather, and traffic. News Radio 93.1 WFLA.
There's this great quote that I actually heard in church, and it felt like it really appropriate, which was, if the spotlight that's shining on you is brighter than the light that comes from within you, it'll kill you. And you see it all the time. Wow.
So that was Chris Pratt. He was on the Colbert Show, Late Night with Stephen Colbert, recently. This is something we had talked about before, talking about his Christian faith. And it wasn't very controversial at the time. Chris Pratt's one of the nicest guys in Hollywood, from what I understand. And that church, the Hillsong Church that he goes to, is one of the biggest churches out there. It's a mega church, not very controversial. It's not like they're the Westboro Baptist Church or anything and having protests and military funerals. They're just a nice evangelical church. Well, that wasn't good enough for actress Ellen Page, which started this whole controversy, criticizing that church and criticizing Chris Pratt, saying, well, they're anti-LGBT, and they should be called out for the, Chris Pratt shouldn't go. Chris Pratt responded to that and so forth. That seemed to be the end of it, but it wasn't the end of it, because there was a Washington Post op-ed that went into this and once again criticized Chris Pratt and criticized that church, which begs the question, are celebrities allowed to be Christian? The thing is, according to Hillsong, they don't really focus a lot on that deep kind of theological questions. They just focus on having a personal relationship with Jesus. They're probably not even deep enough for me to want to go to. But yes, as a part of the Bible, it says homosexuality is a sin. And they teach that. It also says, premarital sex is a sin and so on. And divorce is not looked highly upon, even though Chris Pratt has had a divorce. But what this Drew Goins from the Washington Post is basically writing is that this church isn't good enough, not because, they'll welcome anyone in that church, but that's not good enough. It's not good enough for the church to welcome anyone and try to convict them of their sins and have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. They want these churches to openly affirm homosexuality. Otherwise, if they don't openly affirm, openly validate homosexuality, well, then they're just haters. Basically, is the point being made. So that's the question. Can a celebrity, a Hollywood celebrity like Chris Pratt, it's like the nicest guy in the world, can he be a Christian? Actually, the real question is, can anyone be a Christian then? We should be able to live in a society that's very tolerant of all beliefs. We have religious freedom. Any Christian will tell you that you can still work with homosexuals. You can still be friends with homosexuals. Just because you disagree with something in their life, Christianity has different standards for your own life and for people. But Christians are also called to love everyone. Love their neighbors as themselves. Love your enemies. Be tolerant. And Christians have been historically here, and Chris Pratt is. The goal of this, I'm afraid, and the long-term effect of this is not just going against Hollywood, where Hollywood people are going to be afraid to come out as Christians, which is unbelievable to say, but this is going to go beyond Hollywood eventually. This is going to go to everyday people, and they're going to call out Christians, and they think using LGBT agenda is the way to do it. It's pretty scary, and it really is beyond reason. Hopefully we'll be able to fight back against it.